My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and I don't think I've ever said my last name incorrectly, so that's interesting. Before we get into the show, actually, I would like to just give a quick shout out to a few different brands that I work with for very specific reasons. So Virus, INTL, or just Virus, they are actually having this really cool promotion this month where the technicians, the people that work with them directly get a 20% discount code on for use on all of their products. So, you know, I'm lucky enough to be working with Virus, and I just want to put that out there. So for anyone who's interested in picking up some of their products, which I think it's really like the best compression gear and kind of like lounge leisure gear in weightlifting, I would highly recommend that. So that's PHILWL, PHILWL. You can use that at checkout and get 20% off your entire order. I think I already dropped like $200+ just to pick up some more stuff and also make commission on my own code. So I don't know if people do that. I don't know if that's like actually right, but if you go to Virus and check out that stuff, that'd be super appreciated. And then you can also go to onyxstraps.com. A lot of the people, there are a few of the people who work with Onyx also work with Virus. So just a lot of great people involved in both companies, both projects. So I would go to Onyx for all of your, belts, straps, wraps, all that stuff, and support them as well. That same code works with Onyx. And then I guess go to Weightlifting House if you want. I don't know why you would. But if you happen to find yourself on that website and you are desperate for some clothing or some books, specifically the one that Max and I wrote, PHILWL, that code also works there. So you can use that at checkout to save some money. Now, getting all of the shilling out of the way, Meredith, how are you?
I am doing very well. How are you?
I'm good. I kind of feel bad that I subjected you to all of that. I don't normally do that, but I'm also not motivated enough to pre-record an intro to pop it at the front, so I just have to do it in one take. Usually I usually do it pretty well. It's usually pretty good. But then the guest gets subjected to a lot of marketing, which I don't know how comfortable that is, but I think the show itself is going to be a lot of fun and it's going to make up for that. The reason why there are plenty of reasons why I could have invited you on the podcast or like reached out, like a world champion in weightlifting, Pan American champion in weightlifting. Like you've obviously had a lot of success in the sport, and I think that kind of warrants it in and of itself. But the more important thing is that you're into philosophy, which I think is somewhat of a match made in heaven, given this is the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. So,
Yes.
So maybe we can kind of do this thing where we talk about the last few recent events, so Pan Ams, how your training's been, what the plans are, and then we can kind of rewind and do like a more of a chronological, kind of like bringing us back up to how you ended up getting into philosophy and weightlifting, and how those maybe could potentially converge or diverge, but kind of explore those two things. So Pan Ams recently happened. I don't know if that's like the most important thing or was the most important thing in your life recently, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on how it went, what your expectations were, and all that stuff kind of surrounding that.
Yeah, Pan Ams was kind of an interesting one for me. I needed it as my first Olympic qualifier because there's so many we're required to go to, right? And so we have to start knocking them out. I was on the team as a 76, and we are intending to compete as a 71, or at least try to qualify as a 71 for the Olympics. And 76 only counts for the 81 slot. So
Mm.
total wise and ranking wise, this meet really didn't do anything for me. Don't hold me to that because I haven't looked at every single possibility of every ranking, but I don't really think this accomplished anything except for getting me that qualification slot. And of course, I won another title, another Pan Am title, which is always super, super cool. Um, but it was really the Arnold that was the more important competition
Mm.
for me. So that was like 3 weeks, maybe four before Pan Am. So my training going into this was kind of, it wasn't bad by any means, but it definitely wasn't like
Mm.
the best training I've ever done.
Yeah, for the Arnold, was that something you actually intended to like properly peak for, or to kind of put your best performance out for? And then that quick turnaround, it was like, let's just see what we can hold on to, or see if we can kind of go out and put up a similar performance. This podcast is brought to you by Onyx Weightlifting Co. I've been very selective about finding sponsors for the show, but after much deliberation, in conversation with Chris and Danny, the co-owner and founder, we decided that Onyx is beyond a great fit to support this podcast. Onyx is a brand built on providing the strongest and most comfortable straps, wraps, belts, and apparel to the weightlifting community, with the leather products handcrafted by the same barbell calloused hands that you have. Make sure you pick up something today at onyxstraps.com using the code PHILWL for 10% off of your purchase. That is onyxstraps.com, ONYX straps.com, using the code PHILWL for 10% off of your purchase. And thanks as always for supporting the show.
Yeah, definitely. The Arnold was a 71 meet for me, which secured me as a 71 for Cuba, the first Grand Prix, where I think most of us are intending to put up a pretty big total there for rankings. And I'll be able to do it as a 71 instead of a 76. So it puts me in a good spot. And so, yeah, we really wanted to peak for the Arnold, hit the total that we needed there. I would have liked to go a little heavier, but we had really good snatch training, and that showed off with the 3 for 3 snatch performance, which I rarely ever do. So that was very exciting, a good snatch PR and comp. And then we sort of dropped the weight a little bit and then threw me into some volume for a couple of weeks, which actually went really well. I mean, I felt super strong on stage at Pan Ams. And if the opportunity was there to put up a big total, we were going to. But I had an issue with, I have a kind of a funky right shoulder. And it got a little irritated. It's been like a problem for like 6 years, but it got irritated in Arnold prep. And I made my last 2 snatches at Pan Ams, but it was like massive press outs on that right side. So now we have to rehab that so I can actually lock out a snatch again. But we did what we needed to do to secure the win, so that was cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think it's, it's interesting to hear your perspective, because I'm sure people from the outside, they're like, man, Pan Am champ, that's like the most exciting thing ever. And it's funny because I mentioned it to you, and the first thing you started talking about is like, well, I competed as a 76. That only counts as an 81, kind of like, it only counts as a total for an 81. So it's not really that big of a deal. It didn't really matter, but I did happen to win. So they get, like, the way you kind of led into that was interesting. It wasn't like, oh yeah, I'm the fucking champ, because it's kind of considering like these longer term, bigger picture goals of making it to the Olympics. So just for a little more context, you didn't mention what you actually ended up totaling, or like the lifts you ended up making. So at the Arnold, what was the performance? And maybe you can even talk us through that. Was it like pretty seamless from the bar all the way up, and then you kind of put up that like massive total and did really well? Was it kind of everything as anticipated?
The Arnold definitely was pretty much 100% how I felt it was going to go. So snatches had been going really, really well, and clean and jerks were going okay in training. I think I touched 135 for clean and jerk like maybe twice, and maybe made it one time. Also, both meets were perfectly synced with me starting my period, which is like the worst time of my training.
Yeah.
First, kind of like beginning of my period. So that was kind of rough trying to like hit openers and then go on stage after a rough opener day. And like I know it's not like real, like me
Mm.
feeling bad on opener day because of my period. So I try to just ignore it. But snatches had been going really well. So like you said, warm ups, I mean, bar to stage, Danny and I have been, we keep having these like weird conversations about this 99-kilo snatch I did as my last warm up, which is like the most amazing snatch I've probably ever done in my life.
Mm.
And we're trying to figure out how to do it again. And normally I'm the kind of person that misses. I usually miss around 65 and I usually miss around my last warm ups before
Mm.
snatch. And we're pretty used to that, so it doesn't phase us. But I was no misses. I was on fire. Everything was like super solid. Went out, and we just wanted to get as many kilos out of the snatch as we could because we knew we were going to need it. So 102, 105, 107. Maybe pressed out the 102 opener, but they gave me 3 white lights, so we just
Mm.
kept going. 105 was amazing. 107 was kind of a wonky save, but I had saved a snatch the same exact way like the week before. So um, yeah, it was pretty much like exactly how we thought it was going to go. I had a really good feeling about snatching up to 7, and we made it happen. And I'm sure you've seen the video, but it was a huge release of emotion because I snatched 110 in training like
Mm.
2020.
Wow.
And in competition, we haven't even been able to get close. Even in training, we haven't been able to get close. So I feel like we tweaked some technique the last 6 months or so, and it's really finally like coming together and paying off.
Mm.
And then I was having issues with my clean and jerks a little bit. They just didn't feel like super solid. So we opened with 136 because that's what we needed. And I missed it twice. And then I made it on my third, which is always fun. And I usually do that on snatches. So, I had to change it up.
Yeah, and with that, now that you kind of mentioned that, making a 110 back in 2020, what do you feel like, and obviously you guys have thought about this, talked about it, and tried to figure out kind of like that 99-kilo snatch that you said was perfect. It's like, how do we do that again? So that lead up to the 110, like, what do you think allowed that to happen? I mean, obviously it's the convergence of everything going as perfectly as possible, but like now you're kind of at 107 in a meet. Like, how do you use that information to get back to 110, or is there anything there, or was it just kind of like a stroke of chance?
Yeah, 110 was, I feel like, the convergence of a lot of really, really crazy things going on. That was in like November of 2020. I started working with Danny in September of 2020. I had left my previous coach the year before, so I was kind of coachless ish for like a year. Um, and then the pandemic happened, and then all of our meets got canceled, and I ended up in a weird abusive relationship, I guess. So yeah, this like snatch came about with like me moving out of this abusive relationship, me leaving weird coaching situations and finally getting up with Danny and coming out of a good rest period
Mm.
from the pandemic because I think I took like an entire month off of really training, if not more. And I think maybe I was just like super motivated. Danny tweaked some of my technique that felt really good in the beginning. And I was just like on fire that cycle. I think I like PR'd at 106 the week before, one in 110, and came into the gym and made it happen. I mean, I was still remote and I was training by myself.
Wow.
So I don't really know other than there was just a lot going on and it felt like a fresh start. Like it's like, okay, we're finally like where we need to be.
Yeah. And it sounds like, all of it's one of those things where like you kind of make the decision to um, start changing different aspects that are kind of like holding you back or aren't super supportive. And then, things start coming together piece by piece. And it sounds like that's what happened. And I'm kind of wondering now, you made the 107, and I just rewatched that to kind of get
Mhm.
get a glimpse at the expression of emotions that you talked about. And yeah, that's intense. Like, I think anyone who watches that and doesn't feel anything, I would be severely worried for you. But no, I think that was an insane save, and obviously it meant a lot. So, kind of looking at that, I don't know if you and Danny talked about it, but like, what's the plan, or what are your guys' thoughts on what you could do? I mean, do you think sometime before the Olympics, like 110 is possible, or do you have something laid out to like where the lifts are going to take you, or what that could look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've we have these like sneaky little conversations during training because I like train with my team and he's coaching on the floor and we'll like go off to the side for a couple of seconds and be like, I have a really good feeling about this or I really want to do this. And sometimes we have sit down meetings too. But one of the things we've been talking about is just pushing my openers up a little bit.
Mm,
Obviously, I'm never really confident in snatch, but that's one of the things I've been working on. USA Weightlifting provides us with a sports psychologist, and she and I have talked about having the same like approach of confidence and certainty that I do with clean and jerk with snatch.
mm,
And that coming together with like the more recent technique changes we've made, and we've been drilling snatch like constantly, like almost every day in some form. Um, so getting all that together to boost my confidence has really been working, and it's been showing. So we're ready. We feel like to get out of like the 100 to 102 range. I think I was stuck in like 98 to 100 for openers for a few years, and now we've been stuck in like the 100 to 102,
mm.
103 range. But now we're thinking about like, okay, we're done with this. Let's start pushing it harder now that I have the confidence and the ability again.
Yeah. And do you feel like that's reflected in? So I know some people can like take up to 90% in training and then go out and smash huge weights, and some people might need to take, or feel like they need to take, like 100% lifts multiple times. Like, there's a difference in preference and a difference in confidence based on what you can do, and then what you perceive you can do on the day of the competition. What do you feel like you need to do in training to be able to put up something like a 110 140 or 110 143 or something like that? Is it just getting close enough? Because you kind of talked about it at meets, just having the openers move up to get you in position to actually take attempts like that. But what about in training?
That's a funny question after the Arnold because in Snatch, we definitely like to push it a little higher. I don't feel good going into competitions if I haven't touched something pretty heavy.
Mm.
So before the Arnold, there was a day where Danny really wanted 105, which is like 95%. And he really wanted it, and it was almost there. And I missed it 7 times in a row.
Wow.
And each one got like better and better until the last one. And we were like, okay, I'm tired, I'm done. But he was like, I really just want you to like feel this weight in your hands. And that's kind of how I felt too. It was like, we might be missing, but it's not bad. And it
Mm.
feels good to move that heavy of a weight. And then I came in later in the week and I made it twice in a row. Uh,
Wow.
yeah, I tend to do that. I tend to have a bad snatch day in the beginning of the week and then a better one at the end. But yeah, so for snatch, I definitely like to feel something heavy. For clean and jerk, I feel like I just don't care enough. Like, because I have spent so long being a clean and jerk specialist, it
Mm.
doesn't really phase me. Like, I'll just kind of go out and I'll try to lift whatever's on the bar. I like to get in heavier jerks, um, or at least just like volume with jerks.
Mm.
But honestly, I don't know. I'll just throw myself under whatever they load. So
Yeah, I think there's like a few like really useful points in there for people listening who are maybe younger athletes, or athletes and younger coaches. Um, is that one, you came in and you missed a weight 7 times, so it's like, you know, it's like, okay, I'm sure that wasn't programmed. Like,
No.
come in, take 7 attempts, miss everyone. That's yeah, that's the workout. So I think, I kind of see this because I lift with Max, and there's a lot of flexibility and kind of fluidity with the program, and what makes sense and what doesn't. And I think, as you mentioned, if you're taking a crack at a weight that could be potentially helpful in like getting you to feel heavier weights in your hand, or something that's like a really big lift is like a setup for something else, like, and it continually gets better, and like the attempt is closer and closer, like that's really solid training. And I think being able to make those adjustments that's really important. And then you also talked about like having this like almost predictable pattern of having a bad snatch day at the start of the week and then a really good one at the end of the week. And it's like the more you train, the more you can pick up on those things, like the less they kind of bog you down too when it happens. Yeah, if you have like a really terrible session and you're like, oh my gosh, like everything's going so poorly and I'm just like never going to be able to recover from this, and training is just awful, and it's like, oh, and then you come in and you do really well. It's like, oh, if I can connect the dots, it's like the next time this happens, I don't have to feel so stressed about it, and I can just kind of relax and say like, yeah, obviously I'd love every session to go perfectly, but somewhat unrealistic. But I know that I'm going to come in and smash it. So I think that kind of is a lot of the experience you've had talking. And um, quickly before we kind of jump to the beginning when you first started getting into weightlifting, because I'll be interested to hear about that. You did mention Cuba, which is the next big competition. What's the prep for that look like? How much time do you have, and what are some of the things that you guys are focusing on to kind of take advantage of that and put up the biggest total possible?
We have, I keep seeing people posting like 8 or 9 weeks or somewhere in that range. I haven't actually looked. Uh, as you know, I've been out of town taking time off. I haven't, yesterday was the first time I touched a bar. So
Mm,
that was like a week and a half of time off. I know a lot of people have been posting they got right back into training, but we had the two comps back to back. So I was like, no, I need to get away from it.
mm,
Um, and honestly, I didn't really feel super ready to go back mentally. But I mean, physically, I felt really good yesterday because it's crazy what resting can do for you.
what before we kind of get in actually to the question, what was the workout? Because a week and a half off and then getting back into training, I'm curious to know kind of what that looked like.
Yeah, for me, it was I did a 5x5 back squat at 60%,
Mm.
which really moved well. But my tendons did not like it. So I feel like I'm getting old. Uh, about to be 25. So, that was an interesting experience. I've never had like my tendons feel that way. We haven't loaded my knee tendons in a while. Yeah, so I had back squat, some like 60% snatch pulls, and then a little bit of like overhead stability work for my shoulder.
Mm.
So nothing crazy. My legs are pretty sore, but I did yoga. I do yoga. I did yoga last week a little bit. So, and we like ran around outside and did not weightlifting things. So I'm not going from 0 to 100,
Mm.
but like 25 to 50% right now.
Okay, and then kind of here in the first workout, I think that's cool because that's a setup for, you're basically in shape to feel like you can do 5x5 at 60% and a bunch of snatch pulls and stuff. What's the kind of like path to Cuba look like, and what do you guys hope to be able to do there?
I don't know. Other than Danny made a note in my program that he wants to talk to me about adding another session. So that would move me
Mm,
from 8 to 9 sessions a week. And I seem to be responding well to some degree of volume. I think, like, with the lifts, I don't really know. I always in the past was like, I'm terrible with volume. My body can't handle it. I shut down. Now I'm a full time weightlifter and I can sleep 12 hours a night.
Hmm.
And that seems to work. So I think it'll be 8 to 9 sessions a week of probably a pretty rough amount of volume. And then I'm assuming we will drill like pretty heavy snatches. Like we'll probably do some heavy singles a little more frequently, but just a ton of snatches still. Yeah, I don't really know. I will see Danny again when I get back to Florida at the end of this week, and I'm sure we'll have a long talk about it, but I can't even really tell you right now because I don't know.
No, that makes sense, and I'm sure he's got kind of everything worked out, and put the next 8 to 9 weeks to best use to kind of get you prepped for that. So rewinding a bit, we've kind of discussed like the point you've gotten up to, which is, multiple time Pan Am champ and then world champ, like having pretty much done a lot of the things that are only achievable by a very small minority of people in weightlifting, very, very small minority. Um, Rewinding to when you even had the first thought of like, oh, weightlifting would be a cool sport to try out or something that I'd want to get into. When was that? Like, how long have you been weightlifting?
That thought occurred in the probably August of 2015
Okay.
or sometime around there. I was, yeah, so that was what, like 8 years ago?
Hmm.
I was 17. Yeah, I was 17. I was a senior in high school and I had stumbled around and found my way into a CrossFit gym that had a weightlifting coach and thought I was pretty strong. And they were like, maybe you could qualify for junior nationals. And I was like, okay. So I started working with the weightlifting coach. I have a gymnastics background. Um, and so when I first went to this CrossFit gym, the first WOD was handstand walks and snatches. So I could handstand walk my way around the entire gym. And then I had no idea what a snatch was.
Mm.
So I started taking the weightlifting classes, and that's how they were like, "Oh, maybe you're like good at this." And I bombed out my first meet, a local meet, to try to qualify for junior nationals, and then I went to a muscle driver meet that October with a fever, and totaled and qualified for junior nationals in the spring, and that's how I started.
Wow. So you said you did gymnastics before that. Did you have much of an athletic background that kind of like set you up to, go into a gym where they're like, okay, you're really strong. You'd be very, very good at this if you trained.
Yeah, so I had done gymnastics. My parents put me in the gym when I was 18 months old,
Wow.
like these like mommy and toddler classes. And then I stayed in that until I was 10. And I got burnt out from gymnastics. And my dad actually played soccer at Penn State. So I decided to give that a go. And I picked up soccer and started running track in middle school. And I kept doing those all the way through college, actually. I played one semester of soccer in college and I was supposed to run track too. And then I bombed out at the American Open after a soccer season and decided to commit full time to weightlifting
Mm.
my freshman year of college and never made it onto the track in college.
Hmm.
And I got back into gymnastics in high school because that's a sport in Virginia. Um, and some of my guy friends started working out in the morning before class with our assistant principal, which was really just CrossFit and bodybuilding. And they were like, hey, you're like athletic and strong, like you should do this. So I said, okay. And I did that. And that's when he was like, hey, you should like go to a real CrossFit gym. I have nothing left to teach you. And so that's how I got into finding a CrossFit gym and all of the rest of it.
Yeah, so to make the decision of I bombed out from the American Open to I'm going to commit full time to weightlifting, was that just like what was the difference between you playing soccer and running track and then competing in weightlifting? Like why that decision?
Mm, that's a really good question. Trying to think. So, my my first junior nationals was 2016, and I got third place, and that was right before I graduated high school. I don't know. Maybe I just well, I wasn't really good at soccer and I was good. I was okay. I went to a D3 college, so it's not like everybody's always like, "Wow, you played soccer in college." Like it wasn't that good. Um, I think maybe I just like liked weightlifting more.
Hmm.
I was I don't know, the soccer team, I loved it, and at the same time it was a little frustrating because we weren't that good.
Hmm.
Um, and I think I was more frustrated with bombing out. Like I knew I could do better. My coach at the time was Vernon Patel, if you know
Hmm.
that name. He's a
Yeah.
two-time Olympian. Yeah, my family's from Hawaii. That's how I met him because he lives in Hawaii. Um, and he believed in me. He saw in me what I did not know at the time because I didn't know anything about weightlifting. He saw the potential, and I think maybe him because the Olympics had happened, right? It was 2016, and I saw the Olympic totals, and I was like, wait, I could get there. And he kind of put the word Olympics into my head. I remember like walking in a parking lot at my college, and we were talking about it. So yeah, I think I realized like there was a lot more potential there than I was getting the ability to like actually perform with trying to do two sports at one time in college. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's really cool hearing you say that because thinking about why you would commit to weightlifting versus this other sport, it's like, well, I had this conversation with my then current coach, and he kind of mentioned the Olympics actually being a possibility, and most people, could have that conversation, and most people might, and they don't. I don't think they get close enough to smell the Olympics, but talking to you, someone who's like, oh no, we just need to put up like a big enough total this quad, and then we'll be on the Olympic team. It's like to be so close to it, and to hear that, like, yeah, him saying that, or you guys thinking that was actually spot on. And like 7 years ago, it was somewhat, it was like, um almost like believed into existence, and then you kind of got onto the path that led you to being so close, and not so close as in like not making it. It's like, oh, we'll see what happens in a few weeks and a few months, and then I think that's like really special that actually played out in a way that uh is gonna like actually fulfill that thought.
Yeah, it
I
was
don't I
crazy.
don't know how you feel about that, but
No, it's true. I mean, your question is really interesting to me because I tend to say a lot that where I've ended up and what I've done, I feel like a lot of it happened on accident. Like my friends told me to join this club, and I said okay, and they said go to a CrossFit gym, and I said okay, and they said go to junior nationals, I said okay, and I kind of just fell into the sport a little bit. But to think about why was I so motivated to like keep pushing and keep going, I think it is like that other people obviously saw in me what I couldn't have known because I didn't know anything. Um, and even I thought about this the other day when my college was super accommodating. So we went to AO3 the next year. So less than a year from bombing out from finals, which was just the American Open at the time. We went to AO3 and we were like, there's like a weird chance that I could make senior worlds.
mm,
And I told my professors, like, if I make this competition, I will have to leave for 3 weeks. And they were like, okay, well, like we'll talk about it when we get there. But I was like, I don't think that's going to happen, but it might, but I don't think so. And we go to Vegas and I hit a junior American clean and jerk record and make it onto my first senior world team, which was the first Olympics qualifier for 2020.
Hmm.
So less than a year from bombing out, I started qualifying for the Olympics for the next quad. So yeah, it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and I don't know. I kind of mentioned at the start of the show that this is like the first more weightlifting centric podcast I've recorded in a while. I did one with Mike Young recently, who is like the owner of Athletic Lab, and he's
Mm.
like he's worked with some of the best soccer organizations in North America, and he's just like a super smart dude. Worked really hard. He's got a PhD in biomechanics from LSU, and has worked with like the LSU track and field teams. He's got like this insane resume, but his big thing, because he kind of listed off how he was able to do that and the way he was able to get in with like soccer teams and then to work with a soccer organization that basically like moved him from just like being able to like survive and kind of get by to like doing really really well, was him having his athletes put flyers on car windshields, which I guess is like illegal. He like had his athletes go distribute them so he could pay them some money. And then one guy like picked up a flyer and reached out and was like, "Hey, have you ever done, S&C stuff with soccer?" He's like, I don't think he told him this, but he hadn't. And he's like, "Well, I'll figure it out." And that led to him getting like this deal with a huge club. Um, and when I kind of asked, it's like, the really cool thing about your story is that none of it really makes sense and you can't really follow it and you can't replicate it. And, like, what would you tell someone if they're thinking like, well, how would I do this? Like, I can't do those same things in that order and get to the same level. And he's like, no, the point behind all that, like underlying all of it, is just this willingness to take every opportunity that's in front of you.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what it sounds like when you kind of mentioned that timeline of, well, I'll kind of lift with these people, and then I'll try CrossFit, and then I'll go to a CrossFit gym, and then I'll try weightlifting, and then I'll compete, and then you kind of continue on. It's just like this willingness to kind of keep exploring what like every opportunity will give you. Um, and I feel like, I look back at my life, that's kind of the same story, is just like this willingness to kind of, like, if there's something there that you could do, or you could be a part of, it's like, well, let's just see what happens if we agree to it. So once you made, just kind of following that line a little bit more, once you made the world team, how did you end up performing, in case people hadn't kind of kept up with you since 2020?
Yeah, I think I did my classic, missed my first two snatches, or maybe I just missed my first snatch. I think I did 98, 102. It was my first 71 meet. My weight was a little wonky because I was in college for the first year. And I was like, oh, I can be 71. Cool. And then I just kind of got fat and had to cut. And so that was rough. And also, I was on my period because apparently I'm always on my period when I'm competing. And so the cut was a little tough. So I felt like my legs were a little tired. But I did 98, 102. I think I made 128, 132 for my first two clean and jerks, and I attempted 135, which was a junior world record.
Wow.
I don't know if I'd made it before that, but I definitely attempted it. And I ended up placing sixth. So that's pretty good for the first senior worlds. And I remember being pretty upset. If I had made the 135, Sarah Ahmed from Egypt would have broken the record immediately after that. But it would have been a clean and jerk medal. And that would have been really cool. So I was frustrated. I knew I could do better. And Piros is in the back with me, and he goes, at my first world, I get 12th. And I was like, okay, Piero. So that made me feel a lot better.
Yeah, and you mentioned this a few times about how you typically snatch, and how, recently it's kind of that pattern has jumped to the clean and jerk. But do you get, like, knowing that these like somewhat hyper predictable things happen, where it's like, I know I'm just going to go out, oh, I missed a snatch, oh, I missed my second. How do you feel when that happens? Like, do you get the same feeling every single time, even though you're kind of used to it? like, do you felt like it's been numbed a little bit, knowing that you go out and it's like miss two snatches, make a third, or miss an opener, or is it still kind of like fresh every time it happens? Like, fuck, man. And this is an explicit show, so at least now it is. But like, fuck, I can't believe I missed that. And then you start to get like, you try to have to get like into it for the next one, or you miss your second, you're like, okay, this one has to go. So like, what's your self-talk like when that happens, knowing that you've done it so many meets before?
Yeah, it usually happens when I'm like really nervous. So I do get really nervous still, depending on the situation. So if I'm really nervous for my opener, I'll tend to miss it. Uh, if I can't get into the right mindset of like, I say like I miss my warm ups a lot. I do, and it doesn't throw me. I'm always just like, oh, whatever, fuck it. Like we'll go and make it on stage. Uh, but so like there's just certain meets that will make me nervous for different reasons, and if I go out for my snatch and I'm like pretty nervous about making it, I will usually miss it, and then I go, okay, that was dumb, I need to make it better. And if I miss the second one, it's usually like I overcorrected or I thought too much about it, and then I missed it again and I was like, okay, that was really stupid. And I don't ever remember being nervous for the third one. I think because I think because I kind of miss a lot, like in training, which isn't great, obviously, but it gives me a lot of practice of being like, those misses were dumb. You can make this. Like, just go out and make it. And so, like, when I go up for a third where I haven't made any lifts, I don't feel nervous. I just feel like, oh, okay, now you'll like do it, and then I usually make it, and it's usually pretty easy, and it was stupid.
Yeah, and okay, so you come off this sixth place at Worlds, and then what was the time between that competition and when you won Worlds?
It was so that was 2018. I did the third 71 alternate spot again, well, for the first time in 2019 for Thailand. So I didn't go to Thailand. 2020 wasn't in Worlds, so it was the 2021 Worlds one. So it was 3 years.
Yeah. Did you anticipate that?
Not quite. I remember watching 2019 and being like, I could have medaled. And then so 2021 Worlds was that really weird time when the Omicron strain of COVID came out, and they email us and they go, hey, there's a lot of concern about this strain. If you want to back out of Worlds, let us know by like tomorrow. Maybe not tomorrow, but it was like by the end of the week or something, like, we have to know if you still want to go. Everybody's pulling out. And it was really close to us leaving. And I remember, like, I still lived in Virginia, being on the phone with Danny and my dad, and everybody's messaging each other. Like, all the Team USA athletes are messaging each other, like, what do we do? And we looked at the start list and we were like, we can win, we're going. And we went, and that was definitely like the goal. I left my hotel room to go weigh in thinking like I could come back to this hotel room a world champion. So
yeah. How did it feel when that actually happened?
Definitely surreal. And so much of that trip feels like a dream. I was there the whole time. So they usually like send us to and from the meets like in waves or like individually, so you're not there like super long. But I, for whatever reason, stayed the whole time, like got to watch the supers for once, which was obviously really cool. And it was so isolated. It was a really small group, a really small competition, because like half of the team pulled out, half of all the teams pulled out. It's just this like really surreal moment. in my memory that like the whole thing just feels kind of like a dream.
Mm. Yeah, and I don't know if your like expectations or how you felt about your training or how you felt about what you were capable of changed after that, but how did winning the world championships change the way the way you kind of operated as an athlete after that? Did it, you feel like it opened anything up? How did it kind of change your perception of yourself as a weightlifter? But I guess, I mean, any opportunities that it would have opened up beyond that too would have kind of changed your life, separate from weightlifting.
It was really a double-edged sword, um, because as surreal as the moment felt, like I still remember the moment they like announced my name to stand on the podium very clearly, like all of that. At the same time, I remember coming down the next morning for breakfast feeling, I can't, like, devastated is the wrong word, but feeling not quite like it meant anything, or like,
Mm,
because um the 71 class was totally vacated from the Olympics, right? Because nobody was a 71. And I had Pan Ams 4 weeks before, and I made like 3 lifts, and it was not a good total. It was actually, I think, one of my worst totals in a long time. It was like a 235. Um, so I I had this really weird conflicting sense of like, I'm not that good, but I'm also a world champion. It
mm,
was like a really weird mix. I was burnt out actually for a very long time because I never thought I would win a worlds, but also I just felt like the training had been so hard that year. And I was like stuck in these like 230s. Because even though because I won the 2 Pan Ams that year, and the Pan Ams I did actually before that was good, but the first Pan Ams was kind of the same thing. I won Pan Ams with a bad total and a bad performance, and I just, because they were vacated weight classes.
mm.
So I was just feeling a weird mix of a lot of things. Um, and that stuck with me for like a long time until, I don't know, maybe even like nationals of the next year. So what, like 7 months later into finals? Like, it took a long time to kind of get out of the funk that came with winning that world championships. But as you say, at the same time, there is a huge confidence boost, and almost like, well, I feel like I didn't do very well. I also don't feel like I have anything to prove.
Mm.
Um, I think Dane Miller I saw at the Arnold after this meet, and he was like, it's not necessarily about what I totaled or whatever, but what it takes to even get to be in the position to win a world championships is obviously so much more than the competition day itself, right? So that really helped boost my confidence and make me feel like once I felt ready to train and really ready to like push again, that like there's sometimes in training where I feel like this is embarrassing. If I have like a hard training day, I'll be like, you're a world champion, like come on. But it does give me that little extra push of like, I don't necessarily feel like I have to prove anything, and that kind of is freeing in that I can just like train really hard and not worry about like any expectations.
Mm. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I feel like that's probably something that I didn't expect, but I think a lot of people wouldn't expect, because when you think about achievements, I think most would incorrectly think that they're additive, and it's like, oh, I did this thing, and um like I won this title, or I successfully defended my dissertation or whatever it is, and it's like, those are only good things. They're only additive. Um, but there's like this huge change in it's like your life doesn't change, but it does, in that there's
Yeah.
like this buildup and this anticipation for, and this like work towards, and then it happens, and then it's like, okay, what now, right? Like,
Yeah.
like where do we go? What do we do? Is there something bigger? Is that kind of the goal? So I think you have to like reassess, like, and try and figure out what does it mean to me beyond the achievement, and then if it doesn't mean anything, if it doesn't mean anything beyond the achievement, that's a tough place to be. But if it's like, okay, it does, like, well, let's really lean into that and see what else we can do, not for the sake of like, you know, achievement sake, but because this is something that like obviously want to give so much to, and just take it as far as I can. So I could see why that would be there'd be this really really uh like uh like tense adjustment. I think that kind of makes sense. Then, fast forwarding a bit, so Worlds, kind of that 7 month lead up to like Nationals and American Open. Um, and I guess it kind of leads us to where we are now, for the most part. So I think that was a great way to kind of get a good description and get a feel for your journey in weightlifting. Um, and then of course, the show is philosophical weightlifting, so I'll just prod a bit and figure out, like, as far as philosophy goes, why was that the decision for undergrad? Does it predate that, or was it just like, oh, I think this kind of makes sense, I like reading and writing and logic, which I don't know who says that, but maybe that was the case.
No, it was predated. I I like academics as much as I like sports. So I'd always been driven in my studies, and I went to this camp called the Johns Hopkins Center for Talented Youth, where you take the SAT and apply and take a college course for 3 weeks over the summer for fun.
Mm.
I think I was 13. My brother
Wow.
was 3 years older than me, so we took the SAT together, or at the same time or something, when I was like in 7th grade and he was in high school. Um, and I'm not great at math and science, so I only qualified to go for humanities,
Mm.
and my 13-year-old self was like reading the course descriptions, and I thought existentialism sounded like the coolest thing in the world. And so I took existentialism at 13 years old, which can have an impact on you, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
But I had no idea what was going on for the most part. I mean, trying to read Hegel as a 13-year-old when you've never studied philosophy before is like impossible. Um, but some of it did stick with me, and I was just like hooked. I loved it. And so I went the next year. I took ethics, which is obviously much more accessible.
Right.
Um, yeah, and so I was like, yeah, this is what I want to do. There was also this kind of like joke, not so joke in my family that I would be a lawyer, because I very much always felt the need to like argue my point and be correct.
Mm.
So I figured, philosophy is a really good pre-law kind of undergrad degree, and then I'll go to law school once I graduate.
Is that still the plan?
I think so. I don't know. I would like to go to law school at some point. I think it might be nice to have some sort of break from like really high achieving things once I
Well, I
retire.
mean, I wait. I am very confused. I would like to go to law school because it would be a break from.
No, no, no. I would like to take a break. I
Oh,
mean,
okay. I was like,
yeah,
that's a
yeah.
very interesting evaluation there, where you're like, yeah, I guess law school is like this easy kind of like summer gig that I can do.
No, so initially, once, this is funny, after I was super burnt out from Worlds, I was like, screw this. I'm gonna run for 2024 and apply for a law school. Like, I'm gonna take the LSAT, apply, and I'll roll right into classes after the Olympics,
Christ.
regardless of what happens. I was so done with the sport. Um, and now I don't hate the sport anymore. And I'm
Mm.
like, what if I didn't do that? So, so I don't know what the plan is, but we're gonna chill out a little bit and maybe not do that for a little.
Yeah, I didn't expect. Okay, so you got into philosophy at 13 years old and got into existentialism and then ethics. And it's funny you say that because I don't know. I've made this point a couple of times on the podcast. I don't know how many of the listeners actually are into philosophy, but like when I started reading it specifically, I was like I was like 20, and I've somehow I was able to find like the entry point into philosophy, which is, in my opinion, like Stoicism, because it's
Mhm.
super easy to read. I mean, Marcus Aurelius's book, it's just like a series of thoughts he had, and to my understanding, like it wasn't made to be published. It wasn't made to be public. It was just like his private journal. Um, and they're really helpful and really useful and really simple, simple insofar as like they're not tied in a bunch of like
Yeah.
complicated language, and like they're not, it's not only that it's complicated, but it's like all of that stuff is tied up in other thinkers' thoughts, right? So like all of this is kind of like this additive process of like this person believed this or thought this, and then this is how I'm adding to it or subtracting from it or changing it, and then the language is super complicated. um so I think that kind of makes sense. And then as you got more into it, what are some of your favorite like books or people that you tend to gravitate towards if you're interested in reading more? I don't know how kind of like involved you are day to day in reading philosophy or reading nonfiction or reading much at all, but where would you gravitate towards if you do?
I find myself drawn to. I don't read much philosophy anymore. I always want to, but then it feels kind of like homework, and I don't know how to merge
Right.
just living my life with reading philosophy anymore. But I find myself drawn to like a lot of the stuff I did my senior work on, which was just two separate papers. And then so it's like my two senior papers are constantly like in the background of my mind, I feel like. And then other stuff I was interested, which was really like the existentialism. So my first senior paper was on John Stuart Mill's On Liberty and kind of how it was relevant to mostly the area where I went to school, um, and sort of classic liberalism and what it means to like. I find myself stuck on this now a lot. This idea of like, which you would understand. I'm inspired a lot by Nietzsche to a degree of like the pursuit of the individual, right? And
Mm.
that makes sense given what I do. This pursuit of like the best individual. But Mill brought in for me with in on Liberty this idea of like, let everybody be, but as a collective, like to pursue your best individual self, but also with the thought of like raising the collective
Mm.
community so that like if we're all being our best selves, the community as a whole will benefit. Um, so I kind of get into like that idea a lot of like let people do what they want, but help them be their greatest version of that
Mm.
and pursue that within yourself. Um, and my second senior paper is a little stranger. I don't. I actually can't remember. It was written out of spite because my I graduated a semester early, so I did my first senior semester in the spring, and I was alone because there was no other philosophy majors at the time. So we just kind of wrote whatever I wanted to, and Mill was really attractive to me for whatever reason. And so my second one was in a group of other majors, and this professor presented her idea of like what she thought an interesting senior topic would be for all of us to write about in our own ways. And it was about, I can't remember who the author is. Maybe I'll send it to you later, but transformative experience.
Mm.
It's pretty contemporary. And I just didn't get, I was like, there's no way that you can like go through an experience and become a completely different person. Like that's not possible. And so I kind of used this weird hodgepodge of continental existentialism with analytic philosophy to create this weird paper about like who you are as a person is the accumulation of your experiences and like is going to become what you're going to become, which can only come from who you have been.
Mm.
Like this very circular idea of like you can never become a stranger to yourself. Like this transformative experience will only help you become who you were going to become anyways, or maybe like some version of you that is possible. Uh, but kind of a similar idea of just becoming like your end self. I used the phrase teleological self, like
Mm.
the end goal person of who you are setting yourself up to be. So I guess it's like the same thing as like trying to pursue your greatest self, just slightly different.
Yeah, and you said you wrote that out of spite, but do you believe that?
I do. I wrote it out of spite because I was like, there's just no way. Like it just did not make sense to me that you could like go through a car accident and then suddenly become like religious, even if you're atheist your whole
Mm.
life, right? Like that didn't make sense to me. There had to be something in you that
Interesting.
was prone to being religious or having some sort of faith before the incident, right? But they
Well,
were my professor herself was saying like, well, this kind of thing has happened to me, and I'm like, I've never experienced any sort of uncertainty about my character, about my personhood, that I just couldn't relate to this kind of idea of like complete transformative experience into a new type of person.
right. Like when I think about that, I kind of think about like this like I'm not going to use this in the way it's probably meant to be used, but like this biological like determinism where it's
Yeah.
you have like you're in a car accident, right? And say you do have this transformative experience. It's like, well, you just are you're using the same machinery, you're just using it in a different way.
Hmm.
So the machinery has to exist and
Yes.
exist in a way that is like able to be used to then change to experience the world in a different way. So it's like, if you have some sort of brain damage, right, and then you're unable to make decisions or able to make different decisions, or you have a different like quote unquote like personality. It's like that stuff was all there, and it was just like changed in a way that allowed it to be expressed differently. And I think there's this idea, especially with the way the brain works, is like there's all these functions that kind of like are umbrellaed under like the conscious experience that we have. And I guess you could kind of change them. This is definitely getting in the weeds, but yeah, you could definitely like remove or change different aspects of it, and then you changing your experience, right? Your experience of the world. So that actually makes a lot of sense to me, and I'm just thinking about how it plays out in real life. Not that there's anything but real life, but how it
Yeah.
plays out. But that's
Well,
really cool. So, oh, go
yeah.
ahead.
So like determinism, a lot of philosophy that I've learned angered me until I agreed with it. So like determinism is one of those where I like hated it when I first learned about it, and then I was like, no, it's right, and like in a very convincing way to me, it completely
Mm,
changed my worldview. Where I was like, there is nothing except determinism. Like it has to be determinism, and I see that like in my real world experience. Like we've talked about how I feel like I fell into all of
mm,
the things that got me to where I am now, almost like I it's wrong to say I didn't have control, but like I made the decisions I did because they were determined by my past experiences, by
mm.
my desires, which were determined by my genetics, how I was raised, what my expectations are of myself, Like it was like this inescapable force that has completely guided my entire life, right? Like that's what it is. Yeah, so I felt like that was sort of like there is no person that you're going to become that is not the result of this, right?
Yeah, it's like any person you would become already exists.
Yeah.
It's just like what environmental situations dictate that for you. And what I guess what I mean by that is there's, for people listening, there's something called epigenetics, which is like the response of your genetics to the environment and how they become expressed. So you can have genes that are necessarily like, I don't know if like dormant's the right way to say it, but like they become expressed in an environment with X. So, for example, there's this like there's something called the Dutch hunger winter. I think Robert Sapolsky talks about this in his book
Mm,
Behave.
it's
But
a good one.
that's a fucking incredible book, and
Yeah.
yeah, I remember listening to it because I listened to a lot of books, and it was like it like opens with, I think it was like some like dream he was having about Hitler, and it's really interesting, fascinating book, highly recommend. But he talks about uh, like basically like mothers who are pregnant during certain trimesters when they are exposed to like food shortages, their kids are going to be more like predisposed to metabolic disorders,
Mm,
and that's like epigenetic, right? There's this exposure to an environmental stress or environmental change that then expresses their, quote unquote genetics differently. So it's like, even if you were to say that that's not determined, it's like it is determined. It's like you have this like suite of potential or potentials, and then they can only be realized in the face of opportunities, situations, stressors, etc. um, there's just like a lot underneath the surface that can be different or can change. So that that kind of makes sense to me as I'm like thinking through it now and explaining it and trying to like argue for your point.
mhm.
Um, but yeah, that's really cool. And I know you kind of mentioned that you had to wrap up by 11. I realized a little bit
Oh,
over.
I'm good. You can keep
Very good.
going.
Oh, cool. Yeah, yeah. So one question I did have, and I think this is for people, because I know for myself, and again to the point you just made, and I think we kind of hammered home, is that I got into philosophy because of other people who had a similar interest, and they're like weird people thinking back to it. It's like Elliot Hulse. I don't know if you know who that is, but he would quote Alan Watts a lot, and I really got into Alan Watts. I mentioned him a ton on the podcast. He's an Eastern kind of like he was an Eastern like philosopher, and um, it's actually cool. He lived in Muir Woods, and someone and I went to Muir Woods recently for a hike, like a huge hike, and it's kind of cool knowing that Alan Watts was in this area. But he's written some books that have kind of made me think a lot about the, I guess, like life, and then like Marcus Aurelius and Seneca and tons of people who I think would fall into that camp. I mean, Richard Dawkins to some extent has been like influential in my thinking. Christopher Hitchens. So I would say, like Meredith, knowing that you could potentially influence what someone reads or what they pick up or what they get interested in, what are some resources that you have that you would kind of direct people to, if they're curious to like, learn more?
Oof. I feel like that's so much pressure. I want to say like life changing texts or like world altering texts, like the things that like stick in my mind. It's obviously On Liberty by Mill,
Mm.
um, On the Genealogy of Morality by Nietzsche, that really influenced a lot. Uncertainty by David Hume destroyed my life. I was so angry about it, and now I I feel like it's been good to like accept and understand what he's saying.
Could you explain that a little bit?
So there's this billiard balls example where he talks about like how can we possibly know that every time you strike a billiard ball a certain way that it's going to respond the way that you think it will. And as a young 13-year-old, I was like, well, it just will. Like, that's physics. And they're like, but how do you know? And I was like, I was so angry. And I was like, but now I'm like, you're right. I mean, maybe the sun won't rise tomorrow. I mean, how do we know that it
Mm.
will? You know? um, But it's just such an interesting thing to like wrap my brain around. Like we take for granted certainty.
But
Um,
we really live in this world, and I think so. I just finished a book recently called "How Emotions Are Made" by Lisa Feldman Barrett, and there are two views of emotions. One's like the classical view, and this is like there are certain emotions that transcend each culture, and certain emotions that are like quote unquote hardwired, like anger and happiness and disgust.
mhm,
And those are expressed in very specific ways, in very predictable ways, and um, there's the constructed view of emotions where it's like no, it's they're culturally determined, and they're physiologically indistinguishable from each other. So if you were to look at like how people respond when they're, you know, angry, or experiencing some other emotion, they could be very similar changes in heart rate or blood pressure, or um, how much they're sweating, or like stuff like that, right? And the book is really predicated on this idea that a lot of what we're doing is we're recognizing and creating patterns, um, and I think that is ultimately what we're operating off of, is like this kind of like prediction, it's like pattern prediction kind of machinery, where
mhm,
what's going to happen if I do this thing. It's like, well, I can anticipate it, and I can try to know, but that understanding is based off of my prior experiences doing it,
mhm,
um, and prior probabilities of it actually happening based on information from other people or other sources. So like, what's the probability the sun quote unquote rises? It's like, well, it has every other day, so it's probably pretty high.
mhm.
um, what's the probability of you winning a world championships? It's probably pretty low. So the fact you did that is badass. Just because, like, how many American women have done that? How many American women? And then when you start layering on these other like qualifiers, it becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. American women 71, American women 71 from Virginia, whatever. It's like, there's that quote from that old Cow Strength video. The guy's like, you're the strongest dentist in San Ramon, California, standing in this gym, right now. It's like, yeah, that's true. Because you have so many qualifiers, it really eliminates the probability that there's something else that's likely to happen. And that's really how everything works, is it's probability driven, and the probabilities change based on um, how often it's happened before, the likelihood it would happen again, given the the I would say like how much chaos is inherent within the system. Um, I don't know if that's true, but I feel like that's true. But like, yeah, to your point, it's like, how do we know something's going to happen? It's like, well, you can predict, you can have a probability, you can try and predict it, um, but you actually don't know. But you can change or like augment the probability by certain decision making, like by making certain decisions. So like, what's the probability of when you're 13 thinking I'll become a world champ? It's probably pretty low, but it's like you make all these decisions that eventually give you a higher and higher likelihood of making that a reality. um, so that's cool. I would love to read that. I think I've heard that example before, but I've never actually read that. So maybe that'll be my homework, which I'm not off put by. So I'll check it out. Yeah, I think that was great. I'd be curious to hear, how many people listen to this and then go read some Nietzsche or
Yeah, I
John
feel like
Stuart
I have
Mill.
to like disclaim like Mill and Nietzsche. Like Mill wasn't great as a person. He was great, and I'm pretty sure his family had slaves. But taking like the bits and pieces that are like good and useful, I think it's always good. And Nietzsche, interestingly enough, like was posthumously published by his sister, who's a little Nazi in some of her
Yeah.
writings. It's like very weird to read Nietzsche about like the beauty and the incredible nature of like man, and then two sentences later it's like, but if you're brown, it's bad.
Right. Yeah. I think that it's interesting you kind of mention Nietzsche, because yeah, like I would listen to 'cause I've listened to a lot of Jordan Peterson, and I've
Mm,
also listened to a lot of people who are just like really smart. And they kind of, you realize that like Nietzsche has been someone that a lot of people have anchored themselves on like since. And what I mean by that is like, a lot of people's thoughts or beliefs have been strongly influenced by him, and they kind of make reference to like him being so far, like so incredibly beyond his time,
Mm.
uh, that I think it's really impressive. And I admittedly have started working on one of his books, and it's like kind of tough to read. Um, but yeah, I think that's really, it's like incredible. You started reading that stuff when you were 13.
To
I
be
bet
fair, I
that was
didn't understand it.
yeah. Well, that definitely helps. That definitely helps. Um, is there anything else you're kind of like looking to read at some point? Any book you're like, I really wish I would have read that, or I really want to, or some other like philosopher that you just want to check out more from, that you just haven't happened to do yet?
um, I really love Sartre. I don't know if some people say it's Sartre. Uh, and I've studied him a little bit. I'm kind of obsessed with the concept of bad faith. I think it's super
Mm.
interesting, which is pretty irrelevant to our conversation. But I think it's like, I can't even remember. It's been so long. I have his book. I think it's called On Doubt or something
Mm.
about doubt. And it's like so large, and like all the other existentialists, he's kind of unreadable.
Yeah.
It's definitely one that's been like, I really want to pick that up, and then I always just don't. um, and I also am really interested in, I don't know if you've heard of Wittgenstein. Um, he's pretty also unreadable,
Mm.
but I had one class that briefly discussed him, which was actually a religious philosophy course. But he talks about a lot of things. One of the things he talks about is language games, and like the
Mm.
way that we talk and interact with each other is playing a game. And I find that really compelling and kind of how I understand the world. So I want to get into that a little bit more. And one of his books is just like lecture notes of his students compiled. So that seems very interesting to me. He has a lot of like kind of just like thought experiments or like little short examples of stuff that I want to get into more.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really cool. I kind of makes me, interested in checking that stuff out as well. I don't know if you have any like, um, you obviously had to like write stuff for school assignments, but I don't know if you have anything you've kind of publicly released that people could check out. But if people want to like follow you and keep up with you and chat philosophy, do you have any like websites or any places besides like the normal kind of like social media accounts?
I do not. That would be interesting.
That'd be really cool.
I like one time saw a TikTok and got inspired, and poor Bo got like a 20 message rant about some nature of like compassion and human socialism and stuff. No, other than that, no, you can always message me though.
Okay, is Instagram the best place?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. What's your handle?
It's at Meredith Alwine, just my name.
Okay.
Nothing fancy.
Awesome. And then yeah, for everyone listening, I would highly recommend um, you guys go check out Meredith's stuff, keep up with her lifting. And if you want to keep up with what I'm doing, keep up with the podcast, keep up with um, all the stuff all the articles and all the stuff that keep kind of getting pushed to the pipeline, you can follow me at Josh_PhilWL. It's philosophicalweightlifting.com, philosophical weightlifting kind of everywhere else. And yeah, we will catch you guys on another episode of the podcast next week.